A forest, blanketed by snow, with very little green from the fern trees. It was silent, not an animal in sight, as a light breeze of cold winter air blew across the land. A cabin laid upon the white blanket, dark within its empty rooms, with few furniture standing, a place so few have been. The sound of rustling snow no less than a mile away. A truck could be seen struggling against the pale sand. Eventually, stopping in front of the cabin itself, the truck still roaring from its engine, the passenger side door opened. A child, no older than 13, jumped into the deep snow. The engine going silent, a man with a dark beard stepped out into the snow as well. Both wore dark grey beanies and gloves. A heavy black coat was worn by the man, while the child wore a hoodie and jeans. As they walked towards the cabin, their feet crushed the snow beneath them. They struggled slightly because of the heavy weight of the snow upon their feet. Eventually reaching the door, the man pulled out keys which unlocked the front door. Quickly the child ran inside, as the man followed behind. Closing the door behind them, their breath could still be seen, feeling a bit denser than before.
Anthony!
The man called the child.
I got some logs a couple days ago. They're in the kitchen near the back door.
Anthony nodded without a word and entered the kitchen, as if familiar with the place. Walking in, it felt colder. A heavy weight of frozen air filled the room. Seeing the logs near the back door, Anthony quickly grabbed them without hesitation. Leaving the kitchen, he turned left and entered the living room where the fireplace lay. Tossing all the ones he could carry inside, he turned over to where the man was still laying stuff down. "Dad, I need your lighter," Anthony told him. His dad nodded. Tossing the keys in Anthony's direction, Anthony tried flicking it on, failing a couple of times, before eventually getting the flame to stand and stay. He hovered it over the log, before blossoming into a bright flower of heat, starting small, before sprouting across the log. Blowing on it lightly, the flame began to brighten, and heat filled the room in a matter of time. Sitting in front of the fireplace, the cold, heavy air seemed to disperse within minutes. He heard his father sitting on a couch not far from him. Anthony's face showed no sign of happiness. No emotion was expressed. The room still felt empty, despite the company within. Tossing back the lighter to his father, the sound of the lighter flickering on again quickly was heard within Anthony's ear. Turning his head, his father could be seen lighting a cigar. Disappointment grew on Anthony's face as he turned away.
What's wrong, son?
His father asked in a curious, innocent tone. "Nothing," Anthony responded plainly. His father raised a brow.
Don't need to hide anything. It's our vacation after all.
His father pointed out.
Out with it.
"When did you start smoking again?" Anthony asked bluntly.
I figured, it could be a cheap day since we won't have any more problems.
Anthony didn't respond after that. Instead stood up and walked out of the room itself. His father's eyes followed him as he left.
Before you go off to your room, mind getting our bags out of the truck? Forgot them there.
His father commanded in a light tone. Anthony nodded and went out into the frozen land. Walking out, he tried his best in running through the snow, although like before, he struggled to move his feet through the snow, almost tripping on his feet. Getting to the truck and grabbing the bags from the back seat, a noise stopped him almost immediately. Steps scraping the top of the truck left Anthony frozen in place. Once it stopped, Anthony gathered the strength to look up above. Without warning, a raven cawed in his face, causing him to tumble down into the snow. He felt as if he sank into the snow itself, having a little trouble getting up from it. Able to stand up once more, wiping the snow off his hoodie, he looked up once more to see the raven staring at him. He reached out with his hand in curiosity, only for the raven to caw once more before flying away. Watching where it flew, a figure caught him off guard. The raven flew past it as it stood there. It didn't move, not a single sound or breath. Anthony winced his eyes as he stepped forward, trying to get a better look. However, his father's screams quickly stopped him.
Anthony!
He yelled.
You right over there?
Anthony nodded. Yeah, just fell earlier, he said before walking back with the bags. Walking back, he turned again, still seeing the figure standing in place. Turning back, it didn't seem his father noticed whatever he was staring at. Almost as if he didn't see himself. Without saying a word, they both entered the house. Anthony set the bags against the couch. Crouching down, he opened his bag to get what seemed like a small gaming console. Opening it up, he saw the battery on it was low. Remembering being here before, there wasn't any plug-in for the charger. Even if there was, he forgot to bring it like the past time he was here. Sighing in disappointment, he walked to his room. Every step he took, the floor creaked, the noise filling the house each time. Heat from the fireplace eventually warmed the entire house, making it tolerable compared to the cold air from before. Sitting on a bed, he remembered back to when he was much younger. Memories filled his head, almost like a dream. Whispers of a familiar voice filled his ears. Looking up, a woman with light blonde hair stood before him, with a warm smile across her face. A tear dripped down his cheek as he stared at her. A smile also crossed his face as he rose. "Mom?" he said, as he walked towards her, only to bump into his father. Anthony quickly backed up, as the look on his father's face was one to fear.
What did you say?
He asked, with his tone shifting completely. Nothing, Anthony said, backing further away.
Are you sure? Because clearly something slipped out your tongue just a second ago.
He said, anger filling his voice. I'm sorry, Anthony said while falling to his knees, tears pouring down to the floor below. His father eventually relented, took a breath, and spoke again.
I'll be in the kitchen and make us some dinner. Don't leave here until I call,
he commanded. Anthony nodded as his father walked out of the room, stomping onto the floor beneath him. Sitting on his bed, Anthony laid flat upon it, wiping the tears off his face, and sighed in relief. In his mind, the only way for his father not to harm him is to fake being afraid. Tears and falling to his knees were the only way to escape any pain his father would leave on him. It wasn't simple belt whoopings. Blood was spilled. Anthony never truly feared his father, despite what he could do to him. Pain was something he was used to. Looking back into the doorway once again, his mother stood once again with a smile. Anthony this time wasn't smiling back. A frown grew upon it this time. Sitting up from his bed, looking out the window back at the same spot where the figure stood. Unsurprisingly, It still stood without any sign of movement. He figured he could check it out the next day, to see what it could be if it didn't move. A bad feeling ached his stomach of the thought of it before laying back down. Though, before he could rest himself, the call of his father sprouted him up.
Anthony, food's ready.
He yelled. Without the slightest hesitation, he quickly left his room as his stomach growled in anger. The kitchen table has 2 plates, microwave dinner sitting on them, steaming with smoke of being freshly cooked. Although it smelled nice, it wasn't something to last. Anthony sat across from his father as they ate. His father scarfed down his food as if he hadn't eaten in days. As Anthony ate slowly, they were silent, not saying a word, nor looking at each other. The fire flickered a bit, the flour dying within it as it blackened. Cold air soon seeped into the house, not as heavy as before. His father gave him a look that got Anthony to stand up and go back to adding logs onto the fire. Doing so, the flower blossomed again. Anthony watched as the flames circled the log, slowly burning from the light brown it was to pitch black. Shaking his head, he walked into the kitchen and sat down in his seat. His father looked up at him, smacking as he chewed his food.
Before bed tonight, I want you to put in 2 more logs for the night. Tomorrow I'll be needing you to cut a few for the day.
His father commanded. Okay, Anthony said bluntly.
I'm sorry?
His father asked, raising a brow. Yes, sir, Anthony corrected himself.
There you go.
His father said as he got up and put his plate into the sink.
Wash dishes when you're done, too.
Anthony was eventually alone in the kitchen, staring upon his food, losing his appetite. Not wanting to waste it, he ate it anyway. Washing dishes, whispers touched his ear again. His eyes glanced over to the back door. His mother was standing there, with her usual warm smile from before. It wasn't long before he looked away, only a frown upon his face. Before going to his room, he placed 2 more logs within the fire. He grabbed his bag as he walked down the creaky hallway. Entering his room, setting the bag down, he pulled out a book called Within Another Life. The book was something his grandmother gave him when he was younger. Opening it, he took the bookmark off where he left off and began reading. Soon his vision was getting blurry. Without thinking, put the bookmark back in the book. His eyes soon drifted into pitch black, all sound dulling out. Though within a void of darkness, he felt something grasp onto him, his heart aching in pain. A scream. Not any scream, but a familiar one. Hearing it, his ears felt like they were being stabbed. He quickly woke up, coated in his own sweat, his heart racing, beating against his chest, wanting to escape. The sun shone against the window, brightening up the room. Wiping the sweat off himself, he jumped out of bed to get dressed for cutting wood for the morning. Dressed with a heavy coat and boots, he stepped out where a stump stood. Wood chunks lay beside it lazily, as if they were thrown around. As he cut the wood, the cold air dried his throat, and his lungs became heavy. The morning sun made the snow sparkle like crystals, making the empty land appear more alive. Shadows were cast all around, one catching Anthony's eye. Looking up, his axe dropped to the floor as his eyes widened. The figure was much closer than before. It moved to where it was halfway towards the house. Nothing but a coat was visible enough to see. Not daring to get close, something caught his eye. The figure was looking directly at him. He was no taller than himself, if not shorter, although the thought of something like it was frightening enough. Before he could move, however, the back door of the kitchen opened, revealing his father.
How's the wood coming along?
He asked in a happy mood. I got a couple already, but what's that? Anthony asked, pointing towards the figure. His father looked towards where he was pointing, confusion filling his face. His eyes sporadically move around whatever Anthony was trying to point at.
What is it?
He asked, confused. Do you not see the figure in the black coat? Anthony asked worriedly.
Anthony, are you sure you're alright?
He asked him. Anthony felt confused and afraid for the first time in a long time. His mind was baffled that his father wasn't seeing the figure, which stood no farther than 100 feet away. Anthony himself began to think he was crazy to believe something like that was actually there. Ignoring it, he shook his head. Yeah, just seeing things. Sorry, Anthony apologized. His father patted him on the back.
Got the rest of the wood. I'll see you inside,
he said before going inside again. Anthony still stared at the figure. No movement. Not even steps within the snow. The figure stood perfectly still, as if it didn't really exist, but as an illusion to his eyes. Without thinking too much, he went back to cutting wood. The ache within his stomach seemed to worsen afterward. The rest of the day things continued on as normal. Wood was placed in the fire now and then, not speaking to his father unless they needed to. The house was mainly quiet, with a few creaks and pops from the fire. As he sat on his bed, reading his book, a hum was heard outside his door. It was slight and pleasant to the ear, drawing his curiosity. He rose to follow the sound. It led to the living room, where a woman sat before the fire. It was his mother again, but this time she didn't look back. Mom, he called. She turned. A smile larger than before was shown, except her eyes were gone. Nothing but empty sockets filled them. He backed up as she stood up, walking towards him with a large grin. Backing up, he bumped into his father. Anthony quickly turned around. Dad, he said before being punched directly in the face by his father. The force alone caused him to slam into the wall behind him. Laying on the floor, blood dripped from his nose, coloring the wooden floors with crimson.
Seems like I heard you correctly this time,
his father said as he crouched down and put himself in front of Anthony's face.
I dare you to say that word again.
Anthony sat still, letting the blood fall as his father waited for him to say something. Giving a glare of hatred towards his father stood back up.
Clean this shit up,
he said before walking away. Anthony stood back up once again, cleaned the blood or what he could off the wooden floor. Returning to his room, he shut the door behind him. Opening his bag from before, a knife was pulled out. Turning his arm, he poked his wrist with the tip of the knife. Slowly, he pushed a little within his arm. All he had to do was cut inside and pull the knife up his arm, staring dead at it. Before sighing in annoyance, he threw his knife to the dresser that stood beside his bed. He was tired of his father. yet can't seem to push himself to leave the cruel side he found himself. The next day, he stared out the window again. His eyes gleamed against the light that pierced it. The figure was closer to home, standing not too far from the front door itself. Still, even from his distance, he wasn't able to see anything other than the black coat it wore. His father, he saw, was already up and walking around, phone in hand, talking to someone. Anthony began to feel he might be getting crazy, with his father seemingly walking around near the figure without a single notice. He sighed before getting himself out of bed once more. Walking into the living room, he heard his father still talking to someone. It echoed throughout the cabin, yet couldn't understand what the conversation was about. It ended before he could hear a lick, his father appearing from the kitchen. Anthony was curious on who he was talking to. "Who was that?" Anthony asked him.
Some snowstorm was supposed to happen tonight. I gotta go get out, get some things for us. I won't be back until later tonight and make sure that a fire is lit, especially if it turns out to be true.
His father explained. Anthony simply nodded as his father walked past him and out the front door. The cabin felt emptier than before, though it never felt alive either. Despite that, Anthony went ahead to prepare for a possible snowstorm. It was later in the evening, the sun setting down in the horizon, setting the picture mixture of orange and blue and a shade of pink. Anthony stared outside his window, awaiting for his father's return. It was too long, however, when the night went pitch black. Winds began to grow in speed as snow began moving with it. Watching it slowly, the snowstorm eventually arrived in a strong way, blowing the snow against the cabin, almost like rocks were hitting against it. Trying to ignore the sounds from outside, an odd sound captured his attention. Turning his head, the book within his hands fell to the ground. Down, within the deep snow, barely seen within the intense wind of ice, the figure stood, darker than the void of space itself, yet his face could be seen, grey, with cracked and dry skin. A smile that only death could show. Its coat it wore tightly, hiding a horror unseen. It tapped the glass of the window, disturbing it from its slumber. As it stood, sounds began to dull as the ticking of a clock woke. The smile grew larger as its mouth opened, wider, revealing the dark pit of the unknown and 2 rows of jagged teeth. Its hands grasped onto the window, leaving scratch marks as it drifted its fingers up the glass. He felt a sudden impulse to move. As he did, the glass shattered as the creature slammed through, and now standing up on his bed. The sound of a clock ticked as the creature stared dead within Anthony's eyes. Despite not having eyes of its own, it was clear to Anthony that it could see clear as day. Anthony, without thinking, began to run, which the creature soon followed suit. It ran on all fours, even grabbing onto the walls of the hallway, knowing there was a key hung in the kitchen for the basement. He grabbed onto the key itself, quickly running inside. He slammed the door behind him, which the creature itself slammed into, running down the stairs with a burst of energy, skipping steps as he went down. He looked behind him where a small door was placed. It was a place for refuge in harsh storms. Quickly going inside and locking the door behind him with the key, he sat down and listened. The basement door was opened. The sound of crawling heard scampering around the floors. His heart pumped within his chest once more as the sounds of crawling stopped. Silence was all that filled the room. After a while of nothing, Anthony relaxed himself, calming down, believing he was safe. A familiar hum filled the room. It crept behind him. A chill crawled down his spine as he stood frozen in place. As the hum got louder, before it stopped as it reached his ear, he ducked down as the creature leaned forward, snapping its jaws, barely missing Anthony's head. Unlocking the door, he slammed it once more behind him. Running back up the steps, his knife came into mind. Assuming it was the only way to stop it, he ran for his room. Grabbing the knife from his dresser, he stood by his doorway, waiting. Footsteps were heard coming down the hallway, the knife gripped tightly in his palm. As a foot entered the room, Anthony yelled as he swung his knife. Doing so, blood dripped down to the ground like a waterfall. Horror and tears filled Anthony's eyes at what he had done. The knife was stabbed deep within his father's chest, directly piercing the heart. Anthony let go of his knife as his father fell to his knees, blood coming out of his mouth as he tried to speak. His father grasped onto Anthony's shirt, trying to say something, but only came out as blood. Eventually his father's body collapsed to the ground with a thud. Anthony screamed in horror, tears dripping down his cheeks once again. Before he could mourn, the creature stood within the doorway, a grin still upon its cracked lips. Anthony, without thinking, throws himself out the broken window, some glass piercing through his shirt and into his skin. He kept running through the deep snow and treacherous winds of the icy storm. Into the forest he found himself lost, not knowing where he had gone. He shivered within the cold, freezing to where his skin was turning blue. However, the storm stopped as the storm finally passed. The only light that led Anthony anywhere was the moon shining its gaze on the white blanket of snow. He felt weak, to the point he fell to the ground. He turned, seeing the creature still behind him, standing and waiting. It crept closely towards him. The sound of a clock continued to click. Anthony closed his eyes, accepting the inevitable fate before him. The clock that hung against the wall ticked until it reached midnight. The creature stood, frozen, realizing the next day had begun. The sound of running was heard, causing Anthony to open his eyes again. In front of him, 3 objects lay upon the snow. 2 eyes, one of hazel and one of blue. A knife was in between them both. Stained of crimson, Anthony wept one last time, before eventually going silent. After a long night, the forest was entirely empty. No sign of life, or a sound of a simple breeze passing by. Fire still blossomed, only to eventually die out into darkness. The clock stopped ticking, and the strings were finally cut. I hope you enjoy this story. Please check out the amazing author and my guest, Ghost Ink. His links are available down below. He is a lot of fun and has a gaming channel with Raven, otherwise known as the Raven Dreams, and they are absolutely hilarious together. Definitely do it. This is my last video of 2024. I'd like to thank each and every one of you personally for joining me on this journey. Also, if you'd like to support my work, consider becoming a channel member or a Patreon supporter. Both of them get custom videos and exclusive perks. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.